Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics podcast. I'm your host, Alex Sofronas, and today we're on with Tom Schwab. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tom Schwab. I'm the founder of Interview Valet. We help thought leaders leverage targeted podcast interviews as a marketing channel. I'm an engineer, an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and Interview Valet actually sends a few guests to this podcast every so often. You've built a great company, and it's certainly bringing valuable guests to podcasts. I can attest to that personally.
Yeah, I believe that people's biggest problem is obscurity, right? Today, there's loads of people that would love to hire you, work with you, whatever. The biggest problem is they don't know you. Instead of trying to break through the conversation, get in on the conversation they're already listening to.
Yeah, that's awesome. Tell us about your journey from the beginning and how you transitioned, just a high level career overview into where you are now. I know you've been through a couple of different industries already.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think things only make sense in the rearview mirror looking backwards. And I'm an engineer by degree. So I graduated from the US Naval Academy, mechanical engineer. My first job was running nuclear power plants on an aircraft carrier. And I never thought that I would be running a podcast interview marketing agency. Heck, podcasts didn't even exist. The internet didn't exist. But I think throughout life, we learn and then we continue to grow and pivot. And I worked for a Fortune 500 company, both in the distribution, the operations, and then out in sales and marketing. So that gave me the basis to start my own company. My first company was HubSpot's first e-commerce case study, built that up and sold it off, and then ended up working this company because people said, "How'd you grow your last company?" And I said, "It was guest blogs, but they don't work anymore." So I hypothesized that you could, instead of guest blogging, you could use targeted podcast interviews to leverage other people's audience. So it's always learning, taking what you've learned from one experience and then applying it into a different field.
I like that. You mentioned one way that marketing has changed, the guest blogs, maybe transitioning to more podcast interviews. But what are some of the other things that have changed in the marketing world over the last few decades?
I think the change has only accelerated. We can all remember when you got an email and it was, "You've got mail." And then all of a sudden that turned to spam. And then remember banners and Google ads. People were so excited to see one of those that they would click it. They worked great. And now we don't even see them because we either look past them or there's filters. And I think even to the point now, here we are, the beginning of 2025, SEO, search engine optimization, right? People have been spending decades on that. And I really think today that's more like the yellow pages of our modern day. It used to work, but I think really the future is leveraging Chat GPT and the other sources as our best referral source. And what the large language models love and our clients love is long form collaborative content, right? Google can give us answers, Chat GPT can give us answers, but these conversations like you and I are having here, these are authentic. They're the wisdom, they're insights, and that's something that our clients and the large language models are looking for.
Interesting. So, what are some best practices you'd recommend when creating content like a podcast? What are some best practices to make sure that the content resonates?
I would say what you said there, the guest and the host, collaborative content always does better. And you can see this on the algorithms. If you post a picture of yourself or a picture of yourself with someone else, you'll notice that it always gets more promotion if there's multiple people there, right? Because they've got facial recognition. If I put a picture of this interview, right, on my LinkedIn, it said, "Just had a great interview. So excited to share it with the world." I don't even have to put Alexander's name in there. I will, but they'll know from facial recognition and they'll start promoting it to your audience too. It's the same thing on long form content. When it can be a natural conversation going back and forth, not only do people realize that it's realistic, right? But they also, the AI engines understand that this is just rehashed AI content. right? This is two people talking. We're both spent time in the Chicagoland area, so we may be guilty of dropping the G's from ing when we talk. And that's things that people listen to and they're like, oh, yeah, that's real. And that really builds trust. And after you get the attention, the next thing you need to do is build trust.
That's interesting. I know there's this theory that AI output will suffer if AI content keeps getting fed into it to train on. And that's why it's so important to keep generating human created content. Is that generally your position as well? That it's more important, especially in an AI content world, to create human content?
I, I don't know that it's my position, but it's my observation. Everybody's got an opinion and they're all worth the same, right? If you go to ChatGPT now in November of last year, I don't know if you noticed at the bottom, they would start putting a little button that said sources. And if you put a question, especially on a person or a company, if you click on sources, then on the right hand column, what you'll see it pulls from is Wikipedia. It will pull from Amazon if you've got a book, it'll pull from your own website. If you look at all the things that it typically pulls from, it's long form collaborative content. So podcasts, webinars, two-person videos. And that's what you can see that they're pulling from and what they value.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about how AI sources its answers to questions, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because like with SEO, we could always have somebody on the inside that would leak something. And so there was that human aspect. Now it's really, we're trying to figure out what the machine is doing. Nobody's got any secret hacks to it. Basically, you can just observe it and see what it does. And HubSpot now is talking about two factors that they think are very important. One of them is what they call share of voice, right? How much are you being talked about as opposed to your competitor? And then also sentiment, right? Is it positive, neutral, or negative? So if people are just talking garbage about you, be careful because ChatGPT may mention you, but then they'll also put the sentiment in there. And
Mhm.
that's why collaborative content, especially long form, is powerful because it's almost like you're seeding the content out there to the large language models, right?
So I understand now like the value of being a guest on different podcasts and how that can bring attention to your business. Should they send their executives out to start being on a bunch of podcasts?
I'm not even sure it's executives, right? So much today, we're doing business with the people we know, right? And you think about maybe the big companies. I don't know who's running Ford or GM right now, but I can tell you most people can name who's running Tesla, SpaceX, Google, Apple. People want to know the person behind that. And I think it's even more important once you get into relationship sales, right? B2B, where it's not just a transaction, it's I'm trusting this person. And so that could be a coach or a consultant, right? I'm trusting them with my marriage, with my health, with my happiness, or a business consultant, right? I'm going to take this person's advice on how to restructure my company. And so that doesn't come from just a meme, that comes from hearing them in a conversation. And sometimes that can be a conversation at a industry conference. Other times it could be hearing them on an industry podcast. The other thing too is we all know that we get our best business from referrals. And you think about a podcast, the micro influencer is the host. And in some ways, they're referring or vouching for the guests there. So that helps. And one of the things we've started to do over the last 6 months is have more people from our company talking. I can remember during COVID, a publicly traded company that we worked for said, hey, we got to get all of our executives out on podcasts because we don't want them to be in the witness protection plan, right? They still have to be out there. They still have to be seen. And I think more than ever now that it's not only our clients that are listening to podcasts, but the large language models, right? There's only so much I can say. But if I have other key leaders in my company, they're saying similar things, but from a different perspective, right? And they can talk to clients differently and get indexed by the large language models differently. So it's not just more of the executive's time.
That's really good. Yeah. People ask, what should I be focusing on for the podcast? How do you approach answering that as the host and for the guest? Should they be asking that? Should they be focusing on a certain thing during their conversation?
Definitely, because what you don't want to do is give Groundhog's Day interviews, right? The same stuff over and over, right? I was working with a prospect, and I think they had done 5 or 10 interviews, and I listened to a few of them. And the titles of all the interviews was interview with first name, last name. I, that really isn't engaging. Why would I listen to that? Unless I'm related to them or already a fanboy, I'm probably not just listening based on the name. And then as I listened, after about the third one, I'm like, wow, they've got 30 minutes of content. And that's all they do. And of course, they didn't repurpose and promote their interviews because it was all the same thing. So the best practice is always to think about various topics. What are you talking about that's timely and timeless? What are can you talk about that's impactful to that audience, right? So if I was talking to nonfiction authors that we work with, I'd be talking about different things. If I was talking about category design, there'd be a different focus. If I was talking about how introverts make great podcast guests, there'd be a whole different focus to it. So you really want to make sure that you give content and context with each interview.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what metrics would you recommend that businesses focus on when they're evaluating the success of a podcast that they were on?
And I always love how you have analytics in it, right? Because so many people are just throwing stuff at the wall and they don't even measure what sticks. And I'm like, that's not going to work for you. That doesn't work in good times, much less the challenging times. The first one is the analytics and the numbers of what podcasts are you talking to, right? Do they have your ideal audience? There's a lot of databases you can license to find different things, the reach, the demographics, the value of the backlinks, things like that. But at a very foundational, make sure you're talking to the right audience because you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong people. The other thing is that afterwards, you can judge the return on investment. I would say two ways. One of it is quantitatively, and the other one's qualitative, right? Qualitative is at the end of the interview, did I feel like that was a meaningful conversation? Was the host interested? They understand? Did they ask good questions? Because often the audience is like the host or aspires to be like the host. The quantitative is okay, if I set up a separate welcome page to send the traffic to, how much traffic went there? When I put the leads there, how many people took advantage of those offers? And even some people that aren't doing true closed loop marketing, they'll work it into their sales process and you just ask, how'd you find out about us? And they may mention the podcast by name. They may just say, I heard you on a podcast. And so that's quantitative ways that you can say, yes, this is working.
I love the "How did you hear about us?" I know it's just voluntary and it doesn't cover everybody, but it's such a good way to bypass all the complexities of attribution and just get down to what actually drove it.
And what I love about that too is not only does it attribute it, but it attributes it on what is most important to the client, right? Because they could have seen me on a billboard and then heard me on a podcast, and then they talked to a friend and said, hey, if you ever, I saw you connected on LinkedIn, and the friend gives the referral, and they say, oh, I heard about you from Alexander. Well, that in their mind was the most powerful referral source. I think too often Rand Fishkin from SEO Moz talks about this, right? If he talks at a conference and somebody's, I want to work with him, and they Google his name, but they spell it a little bit wrong, Google's going to say, hey, we bought you that traffic. And then if the person has to leave the website and Facebook retargeting brings them back and they make a sale, Facebook's going to say, we did all that, right? And now, was it all Facebook? Was it all Google? Nothing would have happened had he not been out there speaking. It's like that same customer, if you would have asked, how'd you find out about me? They probably wouldn't have said Google or Facebook. right? They would have said, "Oh, I was at a conference and I heard Rand," or "I heard Rand on this podcast."
Yeah. I'm curious, do you have any stories about maybe like when a guest was on a podcast and then they got a bunch of sales that were attributed to that podcast guest appearance?
Yeah. After 10 years of doing this, I've got all kinds of different stories, right? But probably the one that I point out to the most is we worked with a gentleman, high level tax consultant. And he came to us early on and he said, I want 50 different clients in 50 different industries in 50 different states. And Alexander, I'm looking at him going, why? And he's because right now I am brick and mortar on Long Island and I want some diversification. So this was easy. We start throwing darts at a dartboard, right? Any podcast that could have his client is good, but we're measuring it. And about 4 months in, we get him on a podcast with dentists and we look at the data on that and it's like fish in a barrel, right? He's getting so many people visiting his site and filling out the forms. And so we always do a monthly optimization call and said, wow, this looks like it was great. And he said, oh, yeah, I've already got a client from that. I think I've got two more have discovery calls with. And I love dentists. They're recession proof, they're professionals, good cash flow. So for the next 6 months, all we got him on was dental podcasts. And I thought it was working really good. And then he came back and he's, hey, we need to pause this. And I'm like, what's the matter? I've run out of capacity. I need to hire another accountant. So we waited about a month later. He calls and he says, we need to ramp this up. And I'm like, great. And he's, no, really ramp it up. I found two accountants that I love. I hired them both. Now I got to get them some work. So it's that way of being able to figure out where your ideal clients are, what resonates there. It's a great way of doing market research on there too, because not everyone's going to be a home run, right? So you've got to measure that and figure out why was this a home run and how can we find more that are a home run like this.
Do you have a database that has all of the different podcasts by location, and that's how you found the different podcasts to put them on?
We license about a dozen different databases, and then we have an internal one based on all of our experience. And as I look back, we've been doing this for a decade. 8 years ago, it was more podcast guessing. Now with the data, we can do it by demographics, right? You want females this age to this age in these states, boom, we can do that. Is it by title, right? You want CEOs that work at enterprise level companies, we can do that. Sometimes it's based more off of lookalike audiences, right? One client that came to us got a great consulting business out of the UK. He's written a few books, but he's a high school dropout, built three great companies, and here he is, late 20s, and I want to be on Harvard Business Review, IdeaCast. And I told him, we have gotten people on HBR. You will never get on there, right? Because they're making their money selling MBAs and PhDs. They're not going to bring somebody on that is a high school dropout, right? It goes against what they're trying to do. But I said, what you really want to do is talk to the people that listen to IdeaCast. So we put that in and said, of all the people that subscribe to IdeaCast, what podcast do they subscribe? And so it was that way to find lookalike audiences there. So I always say with the data, it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science, and a whole lot of experience.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I really didn't know that there was that side of the sort of podcast guest coordinating experience or business where you're making recommendations on where they should be speaking rather than just seeing who bites, which is
Ah,
how I originally thought it worked.
yeah. And there are ones that do it that way. It's very efficient, but it's not very effective, right? There's a agency out there and their big pitch line, their value prop is you can pitch 1,000 podcasts in the time it would take you to pitch one. Not politically correct here, but I would say it's the sort of the same thing. You can proposition 1,000 girls in the time that it would take you to do one. I don't think you're going to like the results from either ones of those, right? You could just do bad faster, right? So we really believe that more is not better, better is better. right? Knowing what the host is interested, what they're talking about, where they want to go with their show, right? We had some clients that were focused in on introverts, right? Introverts are a vast majority of the audience, but there's no way in a database we can go through and say, okay, filter for all the podcasts that are introverts, right? They don't have that. But we know through our experience which podcast hosts are introverts or who we think they're introverts because we've been working with them. And the thing is if somebody was extroverted, they would never have the introverted guest on because they wouldn't understand them, because they wouldn't understand the problem that they were trying to solve.
Yeah, and along those lines, what are some of the more common mistakes that you see businesses make when they're approaching podcast marketing, and how can
Yeah.
they avoid them?
I think the big thing is the idea that it's somewhat different than other marketing. There's nothing new under the sun, right? It's just a different version of marketing. So when people say, oh, this is different, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you shouldn't be doing it. So you've got to be able to find ways to measure it. Or when people say it's a numbers game, right? That's a quick way to waste a lot of time and a lot of money. You know, it's not a numbers game, it's a focus game, right? Facebook ads, you don't have the money to target everyone, right? Especially a small business, right? You've got to be laser focused. So with podcasts, you need to use the data in order to find the right podcast, find the right message. Then a lot of people will say, it's podcast guesting, right? I just go on there and I talk. And if I talk, people will just love me and they'll come back. No, that's not how it works. That's not how other content works, right? There has to be a point to it, right? Every podcast, you should know, why am I here? What do I want the people to think? What do I want them to believe? And then what do I want them to do afterwards? I hear so many people that are on podcast interviews and never tell the people the next thing they to do. They never tell them the website, the company, whatever it is. And they're like, I didn't get any business from that. It's like going fishing and you never put a hook in the water, right? You had a nice time, a nice conversation, but don't expect to catch anything. So those are some of the big things there. And the thing is that we've been doing podcast interview marketing and writing about it for over a decade. So it's proven how it works. You don't have to reinvent the wheel on this.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that part resonated a lot with me because I don't have a clear call to action that I add to my podcast. Besides, we'll see you again, or we'll hear from you again soon, or looking forward to talking to you again soon. Like, hopefully they'll come back, but I don't have like, a solid call to action. So I'll brainstorm what are some things that I can add.
Yeah, and with that, is meet people where they are, right? And a call to action isn't always come here and buy this. And especially for relationship sales, the idea that somebody is going to just hear you and then go to your website and go through a funnel and click. Big fish don't swim through funnels and whales don't click. But invite them back, right? Tell them what the next step is, right? If you liked this podcast, make sure to come back to the website. We've got all of these other ones, right? That's an easy call to action. Doesn't take them any money, takes them a little bit more time, but they get value for it. The mediums, and I mentioned the case study in our conversation today. If you'd like to see that with all the graphs, you can come back here. And then if somebody hears you and they're like, oh, you are the answer to prayer. Don't slow them down in a funnel. Let them go back there and connect with you, whatever that is in the sales conversation. For most B2B relationship sales, especially services, that's usually some kind of discovery call. And the funny thing is that we call it a discovery call, but because the prospect knows so much about us from listening to us, from checking everything out, it's really more of a qualification call. They're coming on knowing who you are, what you do, whether they need you. You're just having that conversation of, hey, is this a good fit? Can we bring them value?
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about the future of podcast marketing. How do you see it evolving in the next 5 years, maybe 10, and particularly around the idea of analytics and AI?
Yeah. 5 to 10 years out, Wow, that one is really tough, right? I think that human conversations are powerful and will become even more powerful because there are things that computers and AI can do very well, and then there's things that humans can do very well, right? And conversations, they still sound different. You can pick out when it's an AI there. And it's the empathy, everything with that. So I think the people that try to compete with AI on, can you write a better ad? I don't know. It's like the AI has so much more data to it. But I think for podcasts, talking about what's going on now that we don't have the historical data for, what we're talking about, where the industry is going, that's what's going to be different. And that's what the AI is going to be listening for. And our clients are going to be listening for too. So I think we need to be more human. We need to be more insightful, right? If we're talking about something that you can Google, that's a stupid conversation, right? If it's the 5 ways to write a better blog in 2025, that's not something anybody's going to listen to. But if you start talking about what's going to happen in the future, or here's the ways that you can leverage podcast interviews to make ChatGPT your best referral source. So I think what Wayne Gretzky said, you got to know where the puck is going. I think it's the same way in business here. Because it's changing so fast, we need to be talking about and painting the picture for our clients of where things are going. So I think that's going to be important a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So many of the things that we commonly do, a computer can do that, but they're not going to be able to do conversations. And so even with our team, right? We continue to grow, but we're not adding more and more headcount, right? We're using the tools to get better on that. And I think that's the exciting part. I recently heard this gentleman, a futurist named Jamie, and he called this, we're living in the age of miracles. And if you just look around, it's just going to get better and better.
Yeah, I have a question from the podcast host perspective on the flow for guests joining the podcast. Right now, I do an introductory call with each guest. What's your perspective on video chat intro calls versus maybe sending a video that introduces the podcast and talks about logistics just pre recorded versus maybe sending an AI agent to have that conversation with the guest ahead of the podcast? Or should there even be anything? Maybe it's just an email that's sent. What's your perspective on that?
This is my opinion after seeing 1,500 clients and a lot of podcasts and 10 years of experience. So I've seen that when a host is more of an introvert, they'll want to do a pre-call because they tend to be more prepared. They're thinking it through. There's the extreme extroverts that you get on and you're already recording, right? And let's make the magic as we go. I think the more preparation we can do, the better. So I think from a host perspective, you're introducing guests to your audience, right? You're vouching for your guests, whether you know it or not, right? If one of your guests shows up and they're insulting to the audience or they don't bring value, right? That hurts your value, right? So you always are looking out for your audience first. So I think that pre-call can be good for that, right? To get a sense of who they are. Are they conversational? Are they rude? Do they fit with the vibe of the podcast, right? And using that as a filter. And that could be done before the interview. It could be done 5 to 10 minutes before just to see if this is going to work. But I think there needs to be some time there. I think where it gets as a listener and as a guest is if we have a 10-minute conversation, you got to be careful that all the good stuff isn't in that 10 minutes. Or when people start to say, yeah, as we were talking about back before we hit record, Tom, you were telling me a story back before we hit record. And it's almost listening to the podcast to listen in on the conversation. And now you told me all the good stuff already happened. So I think that spontaneity is there. from that, preparation is important, but we can't overscript it beforehand.
Yeah, I love that. So I think I'm in a good place then with the short introductory call, and it's good to vet out. It's very rare. Occasionally there'll be certain issues that I don't think it's going to be a great episode, and it is important to have some kind of filtering.
And we call it lost on the editor's floor. And this is more common than you would think. Some people, if they're on with a guest and the guest just isn't bringing the value or is too salesy or doesn't respect the host in the podcast, those are the ones that the recording gets lost. Oh, sorry. Something must have happened with the recording. Yeah, that one's not going live. And I give host credit for that. Your allegiance is to the people that are listening to you, your audience, and to yourself. You don't sell that out. You don't sell your audience out to anybody. You don't sell yourself out to anybody.
Do you have any surprising insights you've discovered about podcast analytics, such as Apple not considering reviews as a ranking factor?
Yeah. So we always do a report every year called the State of Podcast Guesting. And I love it when people are sharing what they learned, like with ratings and reviews. Everyone talks about, oh, leave a rating and review. And there was a gentleman out of Canada that did a study, and it was great. And he looked at all the podcasts, their Apple ratings and reviews, and correlated to them where they were on the charts and where they were on downloads. And he found statistically no correlation. What the correlation was, how old the podcast was. And if a podcast was really old, they probably had a lot of ratings and reviews because 10 years ago, leave a rating and review. We were all listening on iTunes, right? That's the only thing we could. So of course we could leave it there. I haven't listened to iTunes in years, right? And the idea that I'm going to go back and put it on that player isn't going to happen, right? The people that all of a sudden have 2 interviews and 200 ratings and reviews, those are bots, right? Everybody knows that. Is when we first started to do this report, it was about 2018 was the first one. And Skype, anybody remember Skype accounted for over 80% of all interviews. They were all audio and everything was on Skype. By 2021, it was like 80% on Zoom because everybody knew how to use Zoom. And the funny part now is that for 2024, it's moving away from Zoom, right? It's moving to platforms like we're using right now, StreamYard or Riverside FM, because the podcast hosts are upping their game. They're getting better video, better audio. So it's always fun to look at the trends in the data. And often people will say, everybody does this. And it's everybody did that 3 or 4 years ago. Pre-COVID, less than 20% of podcasts had video. Today it's 97%, right? Video is part of that. The best day to do a podcast interview was anyone that ended in Y, right? It was funny. All days were the same, right? We weren't going anywhere. But now it's funny. The most common days to do it are pretty much Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right? Middle of the week.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily listening.
Oh,
So I'm not sure on the listening. And that's where it gets hard because if I download a podcast, you can find out when I downloaded it. But if I listen to it then after I download it, you really don't know. And that's one of the tough things with podcasts right now is it's so fragmented, right? With video, most video goes through YouTube. So you can look at the YouTube data, but now it's so fragmented that there's probably at least a dozen different players, right? iTunes, Spotify, Overcast, right? There's lots of different ones. And so it's so fragmented that you don't have all of the data on listenership.
so you're saying that guesting, being a guest, is most common midweek, Tuesday through Thursday?
When you're actually recording,
Interesting. Why do you think?
I think it's the 4-day weekend now, right? People are taking Mondays or Fridays off, right? And a lot of times people will record all on the same day. I record every Monday. If you record every Monday, especially in the US, It seems like half of the Mondays there's a holiday or something. That's not going to work out. Or if they're saying, I'm just going to record on Saturday or Sunday, life gets busy then. And they're like, okay, I can commit to recording on Wednesdays and that midweek. And so that's what we're seeing. Sometimes we'll see clients that'll come to us and said, yeah, I want to do podcast interview marketing, but I can only record interviews on Sundays. And I'm like, this isn't going to work. Right. But now it's no, most podcasters aren't recording on Sundays.
Wow. Yeah, because I don't think it's the other way around, though. I think guests are more flexible, probably. I'm curious what you think about that because guests don't know when my recording days are until we already have the intro call, then they get the schedule. And there is almost nobody who drops out because the days don't align. There are some who are very strict about not recording on weekends. And for them, I typically will open up another slot. But that's like maybe 5% or less.
But I think it's also easier as a guest than it is a host. Right. So, full transparency here. I had an alarm that went off 10 minutes before the interview. Right. So I run in, I put a shirt and a jacket on. My team pulls up brief sheets for everything. So I pull up the brief sheet. I'm reading through everything. I look through the notes from all of our conversation that we had. For me, it took me like 10 minutes to prep, right? For you, right? You've been doing this all day. So you've got to worry about the recording, getting it to the editor, everything. That's the engineer's fact that I look at. It's like the guest does, or the host does all the work. And I think the guest gets the majority of the results from it. So I always look at that from an efficiency standpoint, right? You can either get more out or put less in. And as a guest, it's great to put less in and get more out. She said, I love going to weddings. I don't love hosting a wedding. And it's that same thing. When you show up as a guest, there's no stress, right? We're just here to talk and have fun. When you're the host, you're worried about everything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it definitely is a good deal overall, I think, because there's also the network of the guest that helps expand the podcast. So it's almost like a bartering situation. There's no money exchange necessarily, but it's certainly an exchange of effort on both sides.
Yeah, I heard somebody refer to it as relationship-based networking because we've got contacts all over, right? And I can go to LinkedIn and see how many contacts you have, how many contacts I have. But so often people will say, hey, I notice you're connected to so and so. Can you introduce us? And I'm like, we're connected, but we've never had a conversation. So I really don't know them. And so it's like you take a contact, you have a discussion with them, and it turns it into a relationship. I think podcasting can be a great way to build relationships. I remember a friend of mine, probably a decade ago, started a daily podcast. And I said, what's your business goal? What's your plan for this podcast? And he says, I don't know. He says, I have no business thing behind this. But he said, I know if I have conversations with 365 different people, meaningful conversations that of people that I admire and that I want to talk to. He said something will come out of it. And it did. That was his next business came out of that.
Final question. If you had to predict one major trend in the marketing analytics world for the next decade, what would it be and why?
I'm looking at this as a business owner, right? I think people are going to be starting to focus more on the results than the activity. And I hear this so much from business owners now. We've got so much data, right? We can go to Google Analytics and spend it. But what the business owners are going to want to know is how did this drive profits? How did this drive the bottom line? And so I think there's going to be more of a focus on that. Before that, so much things is activity. And when money was cheap, right? 0% interest, it was easy to just throw money at different tests. What business owners are going to start looking at is how did this drive the bottom line? And so that's the analytic they're going to ask for and to try to figure out how to go through there. We all get these emails. Do you want more leads? We can get you 20 more conversations today. More leads is more cost to work, right? 20 conversations means, oh, geez, I got to hire another 2 sales development reps to kiss these frogs and hopefully one of them is going to turn out to be a customer. No, they're going to say, what is the best channel that we have? And I heard somebody the other day referring to it as we need to get to a sales cylinder instead of a sales funnel. And I
Hmm.
thought that's interesting because he said the funnel, everything you put in the top comes through the bottom, but that's not how a sales funnel works. It's more like a sales sieve, right? You can put all of this stuff through the top. Anything that doesn't come through the bottom is waste. And we're spending an incredible amount of time and resources and effort and people to work all of these to get something out of the bottom. And we need to figure out how to do more of a sales cylinder. So if I need 5 consulting clients this quarter, show me a system how I can get 10 leads that turn into 5 customers. And that's more interesting from an analytics standpoint than how I can get 1,000,000 leads and turn it into 5 clients.
That is such a great take. I think you're absolutely right that it's an analytics problem and it's a modeling problem and not a fundamental problem. It's just our ability to build models that predict likelihood to convert. And as those improve, the top of the funnel shrinks, the targeting improves, and then you can spend more to nurture the existing leads and you can spend less overall. So that's such a great take. Thank you, Tom, for joining. This is probably my favorite, or let's say one of my favorite podcast episodes ever. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Alexander.